every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The night is cold, the kind of deep, biting Scandinavian cold that settles into the bones. It is Friday, the 28th of February 1986. In Stockholm, the work week is ending. The city's lights glitter on streets still holding the memory of winter snow. On Sveavägen, one of the capital's busiest thoroughfares, traffic hums and pedestrians hurry along, collars turned up against the chill. It is a scene of utter normalcy, of routine, of the predictable rhythm of a modern European city settling into its weekend. Among the figures on the sidewalk are a man and a woman walking together. They are arm in arm, without a care in the world. They have just left the Grand Cinema, where they saw a Swedish comedy, The Mozart Brothers. They are walking home, a simple act performed by millions every day. But this man is not just any man. He is Olof Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden. And in a few moments, this simple, unguarded act will shatter the bedrock of a nation's identity. At 21 minutes past 11, as the Palme pass a home decor shop called Decorima, a tall figure emerges from the shadows behind them. The figure is close, almost touching. There are two flashes, two sharp reports that crack the cold night air. The first shot is fired into Olof Palme's back at point-blank range. The second grazes his wife, Lisbeth. The Prime Minister collapses onto the pavement. The assassin turns, runs a short distance, and disappears up a dark set of stairs adjoining Tunnelgatan, vanishing into the Stockholm night as if he were never there. The murder of a head of state is always a profound shock. But this was different. This was not a motorcade ambush or a palace coup. This was a street corner execution. It happened in Sweden, a nation that saw itself as a global moral authority, a bastion of peace, openness, and social democracy. The idea that their leader, who had deliberately dismissed his security detail for the night, could be gunned down like any other victim of street violence, was more than a crime. It was an existential impossibility. And yet it happened. The ensuing investigation would become the largest in the country's history. A sprawling, chaotic, 34-year odyssey of false leads, bungled evidence, and haunting conspiracy theories. It would consume thousands of police officers, generate over 10,000 tips, and fill a shelf of investigative files stretching 250 meters. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a national wound. We explore a case defined not by a wealth of evidence but by its catastrophic absence. We will examine the anatomy of an investigation so flawed it allowed a killer to walk free, and the anatomy of the theories, from Kurdish separatists to South African spies, that grew in the vacuum of truth. This is the story of how the murder of one man became the 34-year obsession of a nation. A story that asks a terrifying question. What happens when the simplest, most brutal of crimes has the most complex and ultimately unknowable of answers? To understand the shockwave, you must first understand the man. Olof Palme was not a typical politician, and certainly not a typical socialist leader. Born into an upper-class conservative family in Stockholm in 1927, his path was one of intellectual and political rebellion. Educated in Sweden and at Kenyon College in Ohio, he was exposed to the deep inequalities of post-war America, an experience that profoundly shaped his worldview. He returned to Sweden, joined the Social Democratic Party, and quickly became the protege of the long-serving Prime Minister Tage Erlander. Palme was a bundle of contradictions. He was an aristocrat who became the champion of the working class. He was a brilliant, sharp-tongued intellectual who could connect with ordinary people, but whose perceived arrogance infuriated his opponents. By the time he became prime minister for the first time in 1969, he was already a towering figure on the world stage. He was fiercely independent, a powerful voice for the non-aligned nations during the Cold War. His most defining characteristic was his unapologetic, outspoken criticism of the world's superpowers. He famously compared the American bombing of Hanoi to Nazi atrocities, a statement that led to a deep freeze in relations with the United States. He condemned the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia with equal vigor. He was a steadfast supporter of anti-colonial movements across the globe, from the Frelimo in Mozambique to the African National Congress, or ANC, in South Africa. He saw Sweden not just as a country, but as a moral force in the world, and he was its primary instrument. This made him a hero to many in the developing world, and a pariah to others. At home, his domestic policies were controversial, expanding the Swedish welfare state in ways that his conservative opponents viewed as economically ruinous and socially suffocating. He was, in short, a man who collected powerful enemies as easily as he breathed. The Sweden he led in 1986 was a country built on an idea of itself. The Swedish model was more than just policy. It was a philosophy of trust. Trust in the government, trust in institutions, and most of all, trust in one another. It was a high-trust society where crime rates were low and the social fabric felt strong. The sight of a government minister on a public bus, or the prime minister walking home from the movies without a bodyguard, was not a security lapse. It was a potent symbol of that societal trust. It was a declaration that in Sweden, such precautions were simply not necessary. Olof Palme himself cultivated this image. He wanted to be seen as an ordinary citizen, accessible and unafraid. On the night of February 28th, that deeply held belief would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. The day had been unremarkable. Palme finished his work at the government offices and went home. The decision to go to the cinema was a late one. Around 5 in the afternoon, his wife Lisbeth spoke with their son, Martin, on the phone. Martin suggested they all go see a film. Initially, Olof was hesitant, but eventually agreed. It was this spontaneous choice that led him to tell his security detail from the Swedish security service, Säpo, that they were not needed for the rest of the night. This was not unusual. The Palme often shed their security for private evenings out. It was part of their life, part of their identity. They took the subway to the Grand Cinema on Sveavägen. They met Martin and his girlfriend, bought their own tickets, and took their seats. The film, Bröderna Mozart, or The Mozart Brothers, was a light-hearted comedy. Witnesses inside the theater later recalled seeing the Prime Minister and his wife laughing along with the rest of the audience. There was no sense of threat, no one watching them, no hint of the darkness that was gathering just outside on the street. When the film ended, around 11:15 p.m., the four of them lingered for a moment on the pavement, chatting. Martin and his girlfriend headed off in one direction. Olof and Lisbeth began their short walk south, heading home to Gamla Stan, the old town of Stockholm. The distance was just over a kilometer. They walked on the western side of Sveavägen, window shopping, talking. It was a clear, cold night, the temperature hovering just below freezing. The street was relatively busy for that time of night, with cars passing and people heading to or from the nearby Radmansgatan metro station. And somewhere in that crowd someone was watching, or perhaps waiting. The corner of Sveavägen and Tunnelgatan is an ordinary intersection. But Tunnelgatan is unique. The street itself is short, but at its end is a flight of 89 steps, the Brunkbergsgassen, leading up a steep escarpment. It is a perfect escape route, a dark staircase that offers a swift departure from the bright, open avenue below. As Olof and Lisbeth Palme approached this corner, the killer made his move. He came from behind. There were no words spoken, no confrontation. Lisbeth Palme later described a man in a dark knee-length coat. Other witnesses gave similar, though frustratingly vague descriptions. The weapon was a large-caliber handgun, most likely a Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum. The first shot was devastatingly precise. The bullet entered Olof Palme's back, severed his spinal cord, and exited through his chest, killing him almost instantly. He fell to the ground without a sound. A second shot was fired, which grazed Lisbeth's back. The shooter then turned, ran across Sveavägen, and ascended the dark steps of Tunnelgatan, disappearing into the city's labyrinthine network of backstreets. For a few moments, there was only confusion. Lisbeth knelt over her husband. A young woman passing by, a medical student, rushed to help and tried to administer CPR. Another witness, an engineer named Anders, used his car radio to call for help, though he didn't immediately know who the victim was. A taxi driver, who saw the gunman fleeing, used his own radio to alert his dispatch, providing one of the earliest descriptions of the suspect. The scene was chaotic, a sudden, violent intrusion into the placid Stockholm night. The first police patrol arrived within 2 minutes, followed shortly by an ambulance. But it was already too late. Olof Palme was transported to Sabbatsberg Hospital, where he was officially pronounced dead at 6 minutes past midnight on March 1, 1986. The news began to trickle out, first as a rumor, then as a horrifying, unbelievable fact. The Prime Minister of Sweden was dead. He had been murdered. What followed in the hours and days after the assassination can only be described as a catastrophic failure of basic police procedure. The collective shock that paralyzed the nation seemed to have an equally paralyzing effect on its law enforcement. The investigation was, from its very first moments, a masterclass in what not to do. The first and perhaps most critical error was the handling of the crime scene. The area around Palme's body on Sveavägen was not properly cordoned off for hours. Pedestrians and vehicles were allowed to pass through, trampling over potential evidence, destroying footprints, and contaminating the scene. The killer had fled up the stairs at Tunnelgatan, a confined space that should have been a top priority for forensic examination. Instead, it remained open to the public. Critical evidence was quite literally walked all over. Then there was the failure to issue a national alert. In the critical first hour after the shooting, there was no systematic effort to seal off the city's exit points, bridges, train stations, airports. The killer had a significant head start, and the disorganized police response gave him every opportunity to make his escape. The officer in charge of police command in Stockholm that night failed to grasp the magnitude of the event, and the nationwide alert was delayed for an inexcusably long time. In charge of the entire investigation was the Stockholm County Police Commissioner, Hans Holmér. Holmér was a charismatic, media-savvy figure, but he was a bureaucrat, not a homicide detective. He quickly took personal control of the investigation, sidelining more experienced detectives. His leadership would prove to be disastrous. He was prone to tunnel vision, focusing on grand, conspiratorial theories while ignoring more mundane but potentially fruitful lines of inquiry. His tenure was marked by dramatic press conferences, bold pronouncements, and a distinct lack of tangible results. Perhaps the most infamous symbol of the early investigation's failings relates to the bullets. No casings were found at the scene, indicating the killer used a revolver. 2 bullets, however, were eventually recovered, not by a meticulous police search, but by members of the public. 1 bullet, which had passed through Palme's body, was found on the street a full day after the murder. The second, which had grazed Lisbeth, was found even later. These 2 small pieces of lead, known as Winchester Western .357 Magnum projectiles, became the only solid pieces of forensic evidence in the entire case. But their discovery by civilians raised immediate questions about the integrity of the crime scene and the chain of custody. The murder weapon itself, the key that could unlock the entire mystery, was never found. Ballistics tests confirmed the bullets were fired from the same gun, but without the gun, they were a link to nothing. The search for this weapon would become a national obsession, with police dredging lakes and following up on thousands of tips about missing or stolen .357 Magnums, all to no avail. The gun, like the killer, had vanished. Into this vacuum of evidence and competence rushed a torrent of theories. The initial assumption, both within Sweden and internationally, was that this had to be a political assassination carried out by a professional organization. Olof Palme had no shortage of enemies. The investigation quickly began to explore several complex international conspiracies. The first and most prominent theory, championed by Hans Holmér himself, was that the murder was the work of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. The Swedish government had recently classified the PKK as a terrorist organization and was investigating its activities in the country, which were rumored to include extortion and drug trafficking. The motive was plausible: a revenge killing for the Swedish government's crackdown. Holmér became fixated on this track. He based his conviction on flimsy intelligence and wiretaps that were open to broad interpretation. This obsession led to a massive police operation in January 1987, nearly a year after the murder. Police raided a community center and arrested dozens of Kurds. The operation was a spectacular failure. No evidence linking any of them to the Palme assassination was ever found, and almost all were quickly released. The PKK theory consumed enormous resources and public attention during the crucial first year of the investigation, a year that could have been spent pursuing other leads. For many critics, Holmér's Kurdish track was the investigation's original sin, a wild goose chase that set the entire process on the wrong course, from which it would never fully recover. Holmér was eventually forced to resign in disgrace, but the damage was done. With the collapse of the Kurdish track, other theories flourished. One of the most enduring and compelling was the South Africa connection. Olof Palme was arguably the most prominent and powerful Western critic of South Africa's apartheid regime. He was a key figure in the international sanctions movement and provided significant financial and political support to Nelson Mandela's ANC. The South African security services were notorious for their ruthlessness, including carrying out assassinations of anti-apartheid activists on foreign soil. Over the years, a steady stream of information from journalists, defectors, and former intelligence operatives has fueled this theory. Names of notorious South African agents like Craig Williamson and Eugene de Kock have been repeatedly linked to alleged plots against Palme. The theory posits that South African intelligence, perhaps with the help of rogue elements within the Swedish police or military, orchestrated the hit to silence one of their most effective global critics. The motive is powerful, and the methods are consistent with the known operations of the apartheid state's security apparatus. However, despite decades of investigation by both Swedish and South African authorities, no definitive, prosecutable evidence has ever emerged. The links remain circumstantial, a tantalizing but ultimately unproven narrative of geopolitical intrigue. It is a perfect conspiracy theory, entirely plausible, yet impossible to prove. A darker, more insular theory also took hold, one that pointed the finger not at foreign agents, but at domestic enemies. This was the so-called police track. Olof Palme was deeply disliked by a contingent of right-wing extremists within Sweden, including some in the military and the police force. They viewed his socialist policies, his anti-American rhetoric, and his support for Third World liberation movements as treasonous. The theory suggests that a cabal of these right-wing officers either carried out the assassination themselves or deliberately sabotaged the investigation to protect the killer. Proponents of this theory point to the staggering incompetence of the initial police response as evidence of something more sinister than mere ineptitude. They highlight witness statements that described men speaking into walkie-talkies near the crime scene moments before and after the murder, suggesting a coordinated operation. The failure to secure the scene, the delayed alert, the focus on the Kurdish track, all could be interpreted as a deliberate effort to muddy the waters and allow the real killer to escape. Like the South Africa theory, however, it remains a web of suspicion without a concrete center. It speaks to a deep-seated distrust in institutions that the unsolved murder helped to foster, but it has never produced a named suspect with evidence to back the claim. As the years turned into a decade, and the trail grew ever colder, the investigation seemed destined to remain a permanent, open wound in the Swedish psyche. The grand conspiracies had led nowhere. And then, in December of 1988, nearly 3 years after the murder, the police made a stunning announcement. They had a suspect in custody. His name was Christer Peterson. Christer Peterson was, in many ways, the polar opposite of a shadowy international agent. He was a local figure, a known substance abuser and small-time criminal who lived in a suburb of Stockholm. He had a history of violent behavior, including a manslaughter conviction for killing a man with a bayonet in a street brawl in 1970. He was a drifter, a figure on the margins of society. He seemed, at first glance, an unlikely assassin for a world leader. The case against him rested almost entirely on a single pillar, the eyewitness testimony of Lisbeth Palme. In a police lineup conducted in late 1988, she identified Christer Peterson as the man who had shot her husband. This was the breakthrough investigators had been desperately seeking for years. Based largely on this identification, Peterson was arrested and charged with the murder of Olof Palme. The subsequent trial, in 1989, was a national spectacle. The prosecution presented Peterson as a lone, unstable individual who may have mistaken Palme for a drug dealer he had a grudge against, or who may have simply acted on a violent impulse. They leaned heavily on Lisbeth Palme's testimony. She was certain. She pointed at him in court and identified him as the killer. The defense, however, attacked the credibility of the lineup procedure. They argued it was improperly conducted, that Lisbeth had been given hints about Peterson's history of substance abuse beforehand, which may have influenced her choice. Furthermore, There was a complete and total lack of any other evidence. No technical proof tied Peterson to the crime. The murder weapon was never found. No motive was ever convincingly established. There was no confession. It was one person's word against another's. The Stockholm District Court was split. The two professional judges found him not guilty, but they were overruled by the 6 lay judges on the panel. In a controversial verdict, Christer Peterson was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. The conviction did not stand for long. Peterson's lawyers immediately appealed. The Svea Court of Appeal reviewed the case and came to a different conclusion. They found Lisbeth Palme's testimony, given her trauma and the poor lighting conditions on the night of the murder, to be insufficiently reliable to sustain a conviction on its own. They highlighted the flawed lineup and the absolute absence of any corroborating forensic or technical evidence. In November 1989, the appeals court overturned the conviction, and Christer Peterson was set free. His acquittal sent the investigation back to square one, but it did not clear his name in the court of public opinion. For the rest of his life, Peterson lived in the shadow of the accusation. He was a strange kind of celebrity, giving rambling interviews, sometimes confessing to the crime for money or attention, only to retract the confession later. He died in 2004 from a brain hemorrhage after a fall. To this day, a significant portion of the Swedish public believes that the police had the right man, but simply failed to build a strong enough case. For them, Christer Peterson was the killer who got away, a symbol of the justice system's ultimate failure. But for the investigators, he was another dead end in a case that seemed to be made of nothing else. For another 20 years, the case lay dormant, a cold case of epic proportions. The investigation team shrank, but never fully disbanded. It became a permanent fixture of the Swedish National Police, a grim reminder of their greatest failure. Generations of detectives worked the case, sifting through the same old files, re-interviewing the same old witnesses, chasing the same old ghosts. The murder of Olof Palme became a part of Swedish folklore, a modern myth shrouded in mystery and suspicion. It seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. But in the 2010s, a new lead began to emerge, not from within the police, but from the work of an investigative journalist named Thomas Peterson. He began re-examining the original case files with a fresh perspective, focusing on one of the very first witnesses at the scene, a man who had been dismissed by police as irrelevant and unreliable. His name was Stig Engström. Stig Engström was an advertising consultant who worked for the Skandia insurance company, whose headquarters were located just meters from the spot where Palme was shot. He became known in the media as the Skandia Man. He was, by his own account, one of the first people to arrive at the scene after the shots were fired. He told police and the media a detailed, dramatic story. He claimed he had spoken to Lisbeth Palme, attempted to assist with resuscitation, and pointed police in the direction the killer had fled. From the beginning, however, there were problems with his testimony. His timeline was inconsistent. No other witnesses at the scene could remember seeing him perform the heroic actions he described. In fact, several witnesses described him in ways that matched their descriptions of the fleeing gunman. He wore a dark coat and a small cap, consistent with some witness statements about the killer. The police interviewed him multiple times in the early days, but eventually wrote him off as a confused and publicity-seeking witness who was trying to insert himself into the story. They dismissed him and moved on. Thomas Peterson, the journalist, believed this was a colossal mistake. He argued, that the police hadn't dismissed a witness. They had dismissed the killer. His meticulous research, published in the magazine Filter, and later in a book, constructed a compelling, circumstantial case against Stig Engström. He showed that Engström had a deep-seated animosity towards Olof Palme and his politics. He had friends in right-wing circles that loathed the Prime Minister. He had access to firearms through a friend who was a weapons collector, and he had received firearms training during his time in the Swedish military. Most damningly, Peterson dissected Engström's movements on the night of the murder. Engström had worked late. He clocked out of the Skandia building at 11:19 p.m., just 2 minutes before the murder. His route home would have taken him directly past the spot where the Palme were walking. He matched the physical description of the killer far better than Christer Peterson ever did. Peterson's theory was simple and terrifying. Stig Engström shot Olof Palme, and then, in an act of incredible audacity, he remained at the scene and created an alibi for himself by pretending to be a helpful witness. He hid in plain sight. His bizarre and contradictory statements weren't the signs of an unreliable witness, but of a killer trying to control the narrative and deflect suspicion. He even called television news shows and criticized the police investigation, a classic example of a perpetrator injecting himself into the aftermath of his own crime. The theory gained significant traction. It was plausible. It was grounded in the original case files, and it offered a solution that was neither a grand international conspiracy nor a random act of a street criminal. It was something in between, a planned assassination carried out by a lone, politically motivated citizen who was cunning enough to exploit the initial chaos to his advantage. The police, who had been quietly reinvestigating the Skandia man themselves, took notice. The evidence was still circumstantial. The murder weapon was still missing, and most importantly, the suspect was dead. Stig Engström had taken his own life in the year 2000. On June 10, 2020, 34 years and 3 months after the murder, the Swedish prosecution authority called a press conference that was broadcast live around the world. The chief prosecutor, Christer Peterson, stood before the nation and made a historic announcement. He declared that the investigation into the assassination of Prime Minister Olof Palme was being closed. He methodically laid out the case against their prime suspect. He spoke of the witness descriptions, the man's known opposition to Palme's politics, and his behavior after the crime. He concluded that they had a reasonable case, that if this man were alive today, they would have enough evidence to arrest and prosecute him. Then he named him. The man responsible for the murder of Olof Palme, he said, was Stig Engström. The announcement was a bombshell, but it landed with a strange, hollow thud. For a case that had haunted a nation for more than 3 decades, the conclusion felt profoundly anticlimactic. There would be no trial, no conviction, no final satisfying day in court. The suspect was dead. The evidence, while compelling, was not definitive. No new forensic proof had been found. The murder weapon remained a ghost. The prosecutor himself admitted that he could not provide a complete picture of what happened, only that they believed Engström was the man who pulled the trigger. The reaction in Sweden was deeply divided. For some, it was a welcome, if imperfect, resolution. The naming of a plausible suspect brought a sense of closure. The Skandia man theory made sense in a way that the more elaborate conspiracies never did. It was a mundane and therefore more chilling explanation for an event that had been mythologized for decades. For others, it was a monumental cop-out. They saw it as the state closing the books on its greatest failure by pinning the crime on a dead man who could not defend himself. They pointed to the lack of hard evidence and accused the prosecution of choosing the most convenient suspect to finally put the embarrassing case to bed. Lisbeth Palme, who passed away in 2018, had always maintained that Christer Peterson was the man she saw that night. The official conclusion directly contradicted the testimony of the only direct witness. And so the investigation ended not with a bang, but with a press release. It provided an answer, but not the truth. It closed the file, but it could not heal the wound. The anatomy of the Olof Palme assassination is not the anatomy of a perfect crime. It is, instead, the anatomy of a perfect failure. It is a case study in how initial incompetence at a crime scene can create a vacuum that can never be filled. The first hours of a murder investigation are critical, and in this case, those hours were squandered through shock, disorganization, and a fundamental breakdown of police procedure. That failure allowed the physical evidence to be contaminated and the killer to simply walk away. Once that initial opportunity was lost, the vacuum was filled with speculation. The case became a mirror, reflecting the anxieties and suspicions of the age. Was it the Cold War, the struggle against apartheid, the Kurdish conflict, or a domestic political rot that had killed Palme? The search for a grand, complex motive may have blinded investigators to the simpler, more disturbing possibility that sat right in front of them, a disgruntled, middle-aged man with a gun and a grievance. The story of Stig Engström, if true, presents the anatomy of a killer's audacious deception. A man who allegedly committed one of the most significant political assassinations of the 20th century, and then constructed his alibi by playing the part of a confused but helpful witness. He used the chaos he created as a form of camouflage, counting on the police to be looking for a professional hitman or a foreign agent, not an advertising consultant from the building next door. Ultimately, the file on Olof Palme is closed, but the case is not truly solved. It exists now in a state of permanent limbo, officially concluded, but popularly contested. The 34-year search for justice ended with an accusation pointed at a grave. The shots on Sveavägen did more than kill a man. They murdered a nation's innocence, leaving behind a ghost of a question that still haunts the Stockholm night. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.